Hi everyone, welcome. I just want to say thank you. It makes me happy. I love seeing where you're watching my videos from around the world. Your support means a lot. Now, let's move into today's story. Halifax is the kind of city where people feel safe the moment they arrive. A calm coastal place known for its walkable neighborhoods, quiet evenings, and some of the most accessible, reasonably priced accommodations in Atlantic Canada. Students, retirees, and families all find it easy to settle in, easy to breathe, because life here moves gently. For Delina Pinsky, this peaceful rhythm was everything. At 71, she enjoyed the stability the city offered. Affordable apartments close to transit, friendly neighbors who greeted her in the hallway, and a community that never felt overwhelming or chaotic. Halifax felt steady, predictable, comforting. Exactly the kind of place where she believed she could live the rest of her life in peace. But in early October 2024, that sense of safety was shattered. Inside a modest apartment tucked in one of Halifax's quiet residential pockets, something horrific unfolded. Something that contradicted everything the city is known for. The kind of violence no one could have anticipated in a building where residents were used to hearing nothing more than footsteps, murmured conversations, and the hum of daily living. The discovery that followed would send shockwaves through the neighborhood, leaving police, neighbors, and the entire community stunned, because nothing about this crime matched the calm reputation of the city where it happened. A peaceful home, a familiar neighborhood, and a tragedy no one saw coming. This is where the story begins. Before her name appeared in headlines, Delina Pinsky was simply known as a quiet, gentle woman living a modest life in Halifax. At 71 years old, she kept to routines that brought her comfort, simple meals, quiet evenings, and the familiar warmth of a home she'd built over the years. She had one child, an adult son she lived with, sharing the same apartment in a quiet residential building. For neighbors, the pair blended into the rhythm of the community just like anyone else. Delina had recently retired after losing her job a couple of years before 2024, an event that shifted her daily life dramatically. Retirement didn't harden her, it slowed her down. It gave her time to focus on what she enjoyed most: watching movies, keeping a calm home, and living peacefully in the city she loved. Her days were predictable, steady, and marked by the kind of quiet that Halifax is known for. Those close to the case later described her as gentle, soft-spoken, and private, someone who avoided conflict and preferred harmony over noise. Nothing about her life hinted at danger. Nothing suggested that violence could ever find its way into her home. Yet behind that calm exterior, inside the walls of that modest apartment, something was building. Something no one, neighbors, friends, or even the city itself, was prepared for. And on one quiet day in 2024 it finally broke through. October 1st, 2024 began like any other quiet day inside the modest Halifax apartment where Delina lived. Nothing seemed unusual. No raised voices. No signs of distress. Neighbors later told police they heard nothing that hinted at danger, just the ordinary sounds of life drifting through the hallway. Inside, Delina went about her routine the way she always did. A little cleaning. A little tidying. Preparing a simple meal. Watching something on her device, the kind of quiet hobby she'd picked up to make her evenings feel warm and familiar. It was the kind of ordinary day she cherished. Calm, predictable, peaceful. But at some point that afternoon, everything shifted. Investigators would later piece together the timeline from digital evidence, statements, and scene analysis. What they discovered was that a simple disagreement, something so small it could have passed unnoticed on any other day, triggered a chain of events that spiraled out of control. The confrontation inside that apartment built quickly, faster than anyone would expect, and far more violently than anyone could have predicted. What began as irritated words escalated into a physical struggle. A sudden burst of fury. A storm of blows. The kind of explosive rage that investigators would later describe as instantaneous, overwhelming, and shockingly brutal. At some point, Delina fell. And then, the struggle moved deeper inside the apartment. For the next several minutes, what happened behind those closed doors turned that quiet Halifax home into the scene of a tragedy no one saw coming, a tragedy that would horrify even the officers first on the scene. But the darkest moment of that day, the moment that changed everything forever, was still yet to come. When Halifax Regional Police entered the apartment on October 10, 2024, they were responding to what should have been a routine wellness check. A quiet knock on a quiet door in a quiet building. But the moment officers stepped inside, they felt it immediately. The air was still, heavy. The living room looked ordinary at first glance. A tidy space. No overturned furniture. No splattered walls. Nothing to suggest the violence that had taken place days earlier. It was the kind of unsettling calm investigators learned to recognize, a silence that hides the truth rather than reflects it. But as they moved deeper into the apartment, subtle details began to unravel that calm facade. A pillow out of place, a faint, metallic smell lingering in the hallway. And in the kitchen, something investigators later confirmed publicly, a knife missing from the block, a detail that would soon become a critical piece of evidence. Still, nothing prepared them for what they found next. Down a narrow hallway, behind a partially closed door, was a small storage closet, the kind rarely used for anything more than cleaning supplies or winter jackets. But on this day, it held something far darker. Inside that cramped space, officers discovered the body of 71-year-old Delina Pinsky, lifeless and hidden away. The position of her body, the injuries she suffered, and the confined space in which she was placed immediately told investigators one thing. Whatever happened in this apartment, it wasn't quick, and it wasn't accidental. Outside, neighbors gathered in confusion. One resident later told reporters that the hallway had smelled strange for days, but no one imagined that anything so horrific could be happening behind a neighbor's door. Another verifiable detail surfaced from the early press releases. Police found no signs of forced entry, ruling out the idea of a break-in within minutes of the investigation. Which meant one chilling possibility was left on the table. Someone had entered that apartment willingly. Someone Delina trusted. And investigators were about to learn that the truth was far more disturbing than they ever expected. When officers first stepped out of the apartment building that night, one thing was clear. This was not a random accident. Whoever killed Delina had been inside her home long enough to leave behind a chaotic, violent scene, but almost no obvious answers. Investigators immediately began mapping out early theories, trying to understand who could have targeted a 71-year-old woman with such brutality. One possibility was a forced entry. Halifax police received dozens of calls every year about break-ins in multi-unit buildings, especially older ones with worn locks and easy access points. Investigators looked closely. Was this a robbery gone wrong? Had someone slipped inside while Delina was distracted? They examined door frames, checked for tool marks, and verified neighbor reports. But nothing pointed clearly in that direction. Another theory was a targeted attack. Delina was known to live a quiet life, but detectives still had to ask the uncomfortable questions. Did she have an argument with someone recently? Did she owe anyone money? Was there someone, a friend, a visitor, a neighbor, who might have crossed a line? Detectives interviewed residents on every floor. They spoke with former colleagues. They even checked local hospital records to see whether anyone had shown up with unexplained injuries that night, an approach Halifax police often use when a violent struggle might have left the attacker wounded. Again, nothing obvious surfaced. There was also the possibility of a personal conflict kept hidden from others, a tension behind closed doors, a relationship that had quietly deteriorated over time. Something subtle that no casual observer would have noticed, but investigators, trained to read the smallest details, knew to consider. Still, the evidence refused to point in any single direction. And then, just as detectives began to believe the case might splinter into dead ends, A new piece of information surfaced, one that would change everything. When the forensic team entered the apartment, they expected a standard scene, something that matched a break-in, a robbery, or signs of a struggle against an unknown attacker. But almost nothing inside that unit made sense. There were no forced entry marks, no shattered locks, no pry tools, no splintered frames. The front door was intact. The windows were untouched. The apartment showed no signs of a stranger bursting in. Everything felt eerily undisturbed, except for the devastating reality waiting in the storage closet. Forensic investigators moved slowly, photographing every inch of the unit, from the hallway to the living room to the narrow closet where Delina's body had been discovered. Her position told its own story. She appeared to have been dragged, her slippers pulled halfway off, her clothing bunched at the shoulders from being gripped and moved. But what shocked investigators most were the injuries. The autopsy report recorded multiple blunt force trauma bruises, primarily across her face, ribs, and torso, injuries consistent with repeated punches and kicks. There was also evidence of attempted smothering, shown by deep red hemorrhaging around the nose and mouth. And finally, the fatal injury, a stab wound to the neck, clean and deliberate. It wasn't the kind of wound caused by panic or accident. It was intentional. Forensics confirmed what detectives feared. This wasn't a sudden collapse. This wasn't a fall. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was a prolonged, violent attack. Yet the apartment still held more clues. Swabs from the pillow fibers matched Delina's blood. Skin cells found under her fingernails were from someone close, someone she knew well enough to fight back against. And a knife collected from the kitchen sink bore partial prints that had already been logged in the national database, not because the suspect had a criminal history, but because he had been fingerprinted as part of past employment requirements for professional licensing. Still, investigators needed more than fingerprints and stains. They needed a confession, or at least a narrative that matched the science. So they turned to the one person who lived in the apartment. The one person whose story wasn't adding up. Jonathan William Pinsky. At first, Jonathan was calm. Too calm. He answered basic questions about his routine, where he had been, and when he last saw his mother alive. But detectives noticed something unsettling. He spoke about her in the past tense without realizing it. He avoided eye contact. His hands shook. He laughed nervously at inappropriate moments. Detectives recognized the signs immediately. He wasn't processing grief. He was holding something back. As the questioning deepened, investigators brought out the forensic findings. Photographs of Delina's injuries. The trajectory analysis. The bruising patterns. The pillow fibers. The knife. At first Jonathan denied everything, insisting he had no idea how she ended up in the closet. But when detectives confronted him with the one detail he couldn't escape, the call logs showing he hadn't reported her missing for 9 days, his composure cracked. He stared at the table. He breathed heavily. And then he began to talk. What he revealed stunned even experienced homicide investigators. Jonathan admitted there had been an argument over subtitles on a video his mother was watching. He described it as a stupid, tiny thing, but something inside him snapped after she told him to leave her house that night. He said he felt overwhelmed, cornered, stressed, and he lost control. He described hitting her, kicking her, watching her fall. He described grabbing a pillow, pressing it down, then panicking and dragging her to the closet when she continued breathing. But the most chilling part came next. Jonathan said he stood in the hallway, shaking, convinced that she was probably dying and that he had already gone too far. In his own words, he went to the kitchen, took a knife, walked back into the closet, and stabbed her in the neck to end it. He insisted he wasn't thinking clearly, that rage, panic, and shock blurred into one. But detectives noticed the detail that mattered most. The final act wasn't a blind swing or a chaotic blur. It was a decision. And then Jonathan said something no one expected. "I didn't plan to kill her, But once I realized what I'd done, I thought there was no turning back. Detectives sat in silence. The calm, unassuming optician with no criminal record. The dependable coworker described as childlike but harmless. The man neighbors barely noticed. Had just confessed to one of the most violent domestic murders Halifax had seen in years. But as the recording device captured every word, investigators realized something else. Jonathan wasn't done talking. There was still one final detail he hadn't revealed. A detail that would reshape the entire timeline of the murder. And raise a new, disturbing question about what really happened in the hours before Delina died. When the investigation was finally complete, Halifax Regional Police presented a case so disturbing, so meticulously documented, that prosecutors moved quickly. Jonathan William Pinsky was charged with second-degree murder, a charge that carries a mandatory life sentence in Canada. And from the moment those charges were filed, the courtroom became the center of a storm Halifax hadn't seen in years. The trial drew quiet crowds. Neighbors, former co-workers, curious residents who couldn't comprehend how a crime like this had unfolded inside an ordinary apartment on a quiet street. Court reporters filled the benches early each morning, waiting for details that had only been whispered during the investigation. As Jonathan was escorted into the courtroom for the first time, the room fell into an eerie stillness. He appeared calm, almost detached, showing little emotion as the charges were read aloud. The Crown began laying out the timeline. The argument, the violent assault, the smothering attempt, the dragging of Delina into the storage closet, the fatal stabbing. Prosecutors emphasized the brutality, the sustained nature of the attack, and the choices Jonathan made in the moments after the violence stopped. Then came the confession. Detectives testified that Jonathan had walked them step by step through the crime, explaining how he lost control, how the argument over video subtitles escalated, and how he believed his mother was, probably dying, before retrieving the knife that ended her life. His own narration, flat, emotionless, became one of the most haunting pieces of evidence presented. Psychological assessments were discussed. His childlike dependability, his difficulty coping with change, and the strained codependence between mother and son were examined by both sides. But despite these factors, prosecutors made it clear. The level of violence surpassed anything that could be dismissed as a momentary lapse. Defense lawyers did not argue innocence. Instead, they urged the court to understand Jonathan's mental state, his lack of criminal history, and his emotional immaturity. They emphasized that the crime, while horrific, was not premeditated. Ultimately, Jonathan entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder, avoiding a full trial. But even with the plea, one question hovered over the courtroom like a cold shadow. What would the judge decide about his future? And that answer would come next. In the weeks that followed the verdict, Halifax felt different. The details that had come out in court, brutal, unexpected, heartbreaking, left residents shaken. A crime like this didn't fit the rhythm of Halifax, a place where people still held doors open, still greeted strangers, still believed home was the safest place of all. For Delina's friends, co-workers, and former neighbors, the trial's conclusion brought a mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, yes, but justice could never undo the violence that took her life. It could never restore the gentle presence she brought into every room. In the courtroom, when the final sentence was read, the judge spoke carefully, acknowledging the horror of the crime but also the profound sadness that surrounded it. He emphasized Delina's vulnerability, her role in the community, and the irreversible nature of the violence. The life sentence, with a decade before parole eligibility, closed the legal chapter, but it did little to soften the emotional wreckage left behind. After the sentencing, statements emerged from people who knew Delina personally. They didn't describe her by the tragedy that took her life, but by the warmth that defined it. She was remembered as calm, patient, and endlessly devoted to helping others learn. It was then that many learned something that struck the city even harder. Delina had spent years as the reading support coordinator at the North End Public Library. Not just an employee, not just a volunteer, but a lifeline for adults and children who struggled with literacy. Colleagues said it was her true passion, her purpose, her joy. She guided newcomers learning English for the first time. She sat with seniors who were embarrassed to admit they had forgotten how to read. She celebrated with children who checked out their first book on their own. The library wasn't just where she worked, it was where she shined. And that is what Halifax chooses to hold on to. Not the brutality of her final moments, but the quiet heroism of her daily life. A woman who loved stories, who believed in their power, and who made it her mission to share that power with anyone who needed it. In the end, that is the legacy that lives on in the North End Public Library, between the shelves she once tended, in the reading rooms she once filled with hope, and in the hearts of every person whose life she touched. Her story ends in tragedy, but the impact she left behind continues to turn pages. Thank you to my wonderful subscribers. I suffer from insomnia. I hope when I get to 1,000 subscribers I can finally get to sleep well.